Officially, let me warmly welcome all the panelists and all the participants of today's session, which is a part of the symposium under the title "Identifying and Countering Holocaust Distortion: Lessons for and from Southeast Asia." The symposium is taking part in the frames of a project conducted by the Never Again Association with the support of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and Heinrich Boell Stiftung Cambodia. Speaking of Cambodia, if you need to use the translation into Khmer, please use the settings at the bottom of the screen under interpretation. You can switch to the Khmer interpretation, the Khmer language version of our session. The project is conducted in close cooperation and partnership with our friends in Southeast Asia, including the Balac Program at the Faculty of Arts of Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, as well as Phnom Penh, the American University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Three countries are in the main focus of the project, that is Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. And we believe that through discussing, identifying, and tackling the issue of Holocaust distortion and denial, and more generally speaking, the denial of genocide and human rights violations, we can contribute to intercultural dialogue, to building empathy and solidarity. If you are interested in some more information about the future activities within this project, as well as past activities within this project, we would like to invite you to check out the website of the Never Again Association, the website of the project, as well as our social media profiles, which will be shared throughout the session. I should also stress that the session today is the first one of events which are going to last until the 26th of November. So I very much hope you will stay with us for the next days too. Today's session has already been very popular. We have more than 1,000 registered participants from numerous countries in Asia, in Europe, and in fact all over the world. So I very much look forward to our discussions. You are more than welcome to write your comments, your questions in the chat box. Even if we don't manage to discuss every comment or every question, our colleagues are going to collect them, and they could be used for the final report. We have a very distinguished speaker today, Teun van Dijk, but before he is introduced, I would like to express special gratitude to our friends at the Balac Program in Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. And I would like to invite Dr. Kunnaya Wimooktanon, the director of the Balac Program, to say a few words. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Rafal. So thank you, Dr. Pankowski, for the introduction. The Balac Program, or the Bachelor of Arts in Language and Culture program, is honored to be asked to collaborate with the Never Again Association, the American University of Phnom Penh, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on this very special event. And of course, thank you to Professor Chulalongkorn van Dijk. I hope I'm saying your name right. I'm trying the best I can, I'm sorry. But despite all of the purported advances of the human civilization that we have seen thus far, we often seem to be on the brink of repeating some of the worst mistakes of our past. We seem to think that we are smarter than those who came before us, that we will not make their mistakes and allow for the repeat, we will not make their mistakes and allow for the repeat of the evils of the Holocaust. And yet, every once in a while, genocide rears its ugly head ever since the end of the Second World War, reminding humanity of its hubris and our failure to our fellow human beings. In our collaboration here today, and with the help of Professor Chulalongkorn van Dijk as our speaker, I hope that all of us here today would play a small part in breaking that cycle, perhaps in the critical analysis of what may, to some, seems like the ignorable discourse of the extremist fringe. Humanity might learn to better spot the warning signs and act against them before it becomes too late. But you're not here to listen to me and my hypothetical musings of a better tomorrow. So please allow me to give a very warm welcome to the figurative stage, Professor Chulalongkorn van Dijk of Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona. Dr. van Dijk, or Professor van Dijk.
And if I can inject something at this moment, just before Professor van Dijk speaks, I also wanted to express special gratitude to Dr. Verita Sriratana, who is also a long-time good friend of the Never Again Association. She is the associate professor at the Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University. She is also currently visiting research fellow in human rights at the Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund in Sweden. And Verita is going to be the moderator of this session. So Verita, would you like to say a few words before we go into the main part, which is the keynote speech?
Of course. Thank you very much, Rafal. And I think that we can be on the first name basis here, so please call me Verita. So thank you very much for your kind introduction. Once again, hello and warmest greetings to everyone. It is my utmost honor and pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker for the Identifying and Countering Holocaust Distortion, Lessons for and from Southeast Asia Symposium. Now, if I may add a few words. The root of critical discourse analysis is, what should I say, it's remarkably multifold and multidisciplinary. So it is no wonder that CDA has fantastically united many of us here coming from so many disciplines, and I'm being random here, be they sociolinguistics, cognitive sciences, history, literary studies, philosophy, anthropology, to name but a few. I'd personally like to make full use of this occasion to pay homage to a group of scholars who first discussed theories and methods of discourse analysis in the 80s and 90s, and one of them is with us today. Professor Chulalongkorn Adrianus van Dijk is the co-founder of Critical Discourse Analysis and director of the Center of Discourse Studies. He was professor of discourse studies at the University of Amsterdam until 2004 and is at present professor at Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona. After earlier work on generative poetics, text grammar, and the psychology of text processing, his work since 1980 takes a more critical perspective and deals with discursive racism, news in the press, ideology, knowledge, and context, which are very important, I think, in our day and age. Professor van Dijk is the author of several books in most of these areas, and he edited the Handbook of Discourse Analysis, a total of 4 volumes in the year 1985, the introductory book, Discourse Studies, second edition in 2011, as well as the Reader, the Study of Discourse, a total of 5 volumes in 2007. He founded, staggering number, 6 international journals, namely Poetics, Text, now known as Text and Talk, Discourse and Society, Discourse Studies, Discourse and Communication, and the Internet journal in Spanish, Discurso y Sociedad. He still serves as editor for Discourse and Society, Discourse Studies, and Discourse and Communication. For more information, he's very generous. Please visit this website, www.discoursestudies.org. Another topic of Professor van Dijk's talk today is Critical Discourse Analysis approach to study anti-minority discourses, racism, and genocide denial. And if I may add quickly again to just say, to emphasize, what Rafal already said, before we send a virtual round of applause, and cheers to our honorary speaker. If anyone here in the audience would like to ask questions, please feel free to type into the chat box or Q&A box. There are 2 boxes, right? You can type in each anytime. Doing so will not interrupt the flow of Professor van Dijk's talk and discussion in any way. And your questions will be read out at the end of the talk or collect, like what Rafal said, at the end of the talk. So Professor van Dijk, the screen, instead of the floor, the Zoom screen is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Verita, for your presentation. It's really a great honor to be with you. I thought I would be speaking only with a few people in Thailand, but it's obvious also from the chat box that people are talking from everywhere. So I thought I would just say Sawatika in the few words in Thai I know, and thank you for this incredible invitation. But since people are speaking and participating in many countries, I would have to speak many more languages. And so I'll keep just to speak in Dutch about my work. I am specifically glad that I am now able to talk to you online after visiting many countries in Southeast Asia in the last years. I've been in Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam. So it's nice that I'm now able to talk to you directly. What I would like to do today is to present just some basics of critical discourse analysis for people who don't know. So also from what Verita is saying, many of you are specialists already. And for many of you, I won't be able to say something very new because I also assume that I would like to speak for a broader audience and not just for specialists. I would like to say something about my work of the last few years and see how this is relevant. I have to excuse myself, first of all, to all of you for the fact that I have not been working on Holocaust denial. So that is not my specialty. I wish I could do so, and especially since I have been working with my friend and colleague, a famous person in critical discourse studies, Ruth Wodak. She would be much better placed to talk about that topic than me. I've been working on denial of racism in the 1990s, and so many of these topics are very close to my actual work. But let me just give you some basic news. So what I would like to do today is to briefly say something about CDA and CDS for people who don't know. Verita already said much about my work, so I don't have to talk too much about that. And I'll have also some thoughts about how to apply CDA today, because my main message today will not be summarizing in a few words what discourse analysis is all about. You can read that in many introductions today. There are many handbooks, papers, journals. So that you can also read. I would like to stimulate all of you who don't do this yet to enter this field and apply your own knowledge in various disciplines of the humanities and the social sciences in such very fundamental problems today as the denial of the Holocaust, denial of genocide, and other very fundamental aspects which we, as linguists, discourse analysts, psychologists, social scientists, can apply in this particular kind of field. So let me just briefly, in a few minutes, for those who are not familiar with discourse studies, just tell the following, that most of linguistics in the 1960s mostly was limited mostly to the study of sentences, words and sentences, and only in the 1670s, in several disciplines like in linguistics, in anthropology and sociology, they said, well, language use is not just sentences or words, but actual text and talk. So in linguistics, people developed text grammars. In anthropology, as you know, of the work of Delheims and others, people started to study communicative events. And as you also know, in sociology, people more and more were interested in conversation and actual interaction. That are all now, many, many years later, fundamental aspects of the study of discourse. And within this whole huge field of discourse studies in many, many disciplines of the humanities and the social sciences, towards the end of the 70s and beginning of the 1980s, in several countries, also people were saying, well, there is a very fundamental dimension missing in discourse study. We should not just study the structure of discourse, studies of coherence and macro structures and all kinds of other things. We should also pay attention to the more critical socio-political aspects of discourse. Discourse also has to do with power and power abuse. So just to mention an interesting book at the end of the 1970s, Roger Fowler and others edited a book called Language and Control, and there produced also the first studies of what they called critical linguistics. In the 1980s, also Norman Fairclough in England presented several studies about critical language studies, which afterwards have been dominant in the field of critical discourse studies. Ruth Wodak, whom I already mentioned, a famous colleague in Vienna, who also was at time in Lancaster in England, was working on racism, anti-Semitism, discourse and gender, many, many aspects. So if you ever want to get to know more about critical discourse studies and you haven't done so yet, please go and find the work of Ruth Wodak. I myself have been working mostly since the 1980s on racist discourse and today also on anti-racist discourse. And on that, I would like to speak later a little bit more. So today, critical discourse studies is a large domain of studies, of journals, of congresses, and so on. It is very popular also in Latin America. And I now am hearing that also in Southeast Asia, for example, critical discourse studies is a field now being practiced by people in many, many disciplines. So I'm very glad to hear that. And later, if we have questions, I very much also would like to reply to questions. Let me just briefly say a little bit about my own work so that you know my development. And if you want to read about that, many of these studies are on my website and will be on my website. So if you want to read more, many of the papers and even books are there. Strangely, although today we are fundamentally speaking about a topic so important as Holocaust denial and genocide denial, racism denial, denial also of the climate catastrophe, many forms of denial and fake news and so on. I began my studies in the 1960s, many, many years ago, on studying French poetry. So my first studies were on a French poet called Paul Éluard, a very long time ago, and also very far away from what I'm doing now. But what I learned from looking at poetry was to take each word of a text seriously. And that sometimes what is written there is not exactly explicit. You have to literally learn to read between the lines and behind the lines. That was one of the things I learned from studying poetry many, many years ago. Then for my PhD, I worked on text grammar also in the 1970s on discourse pragmatics, talking about not just speech acts, as you know, in pragmatics, but also on macro speech act, and to try to extend the work in discourse analysis also to other fields like pragmatics, semiotic, and so on. Another point very important for me is my work on the cognitive psychology of text comprehension, which I did mostly with a North American psychologist, Walter Kinch, in the book of '83. And I'm not going to elaborate on this very much now, but the important thing of that is that different from many of my colleagues in critical discourse studies, I'm not just interested in all structures of discourse. You all are interested in and analyzing, and not just all the structures of society, like forms of abuse, domination, genocide, racism, sexism, and so on. I'm also interested in the socio-cognitive aspects of discourse. So my point is, and theoretically very important, that between, on the one hand, discourse structures at all these levels you all know, and the social structures at all levels, which you know from social sciences, political science, and so on, there is this extremely important cognitive and socio-cognitive dimension about which I would like to emphasize, especially the role of course, knowledge. Because if we are going to speak about the denial of the Holocaust, or the denial of genocide, or denial of climate catastrophe, the very fundamental notion of knowledge is crucial. That discourse is based and must be based on knowledge. And that opinions are also based on ideology in discourse, that is very fundamental. So the relationship that all levels of discourse are related to also to all levels of cognition, about which I'll talk about it later. So when I said that in the beginning of the 1980s, I began to study also racist discourse, first in my own country in Holland, and then also in many other countries in Europe, in North America, and also in Latin America. I was specifically also interested in the role of what I call the symbolic elites. The symbolic elites are those people and organizations who control public discourse. And this is extremely important because we should not just talk about discourse structures, but also about the production of discourse, as we also know in psychology of discourse, but also in the kind of social structures and people who are responsible for this kind of thing, the symbolic elites. So very often, as I will see later also, very often people are blaming the people, for example, in the study of populism, for spreading on, for example, social media, like Facebook and so on, all kinds of forms of racism, xenophobia, and sexism. But my main thesis, already in my book of 1993 on discourse, elite discourse and racism, that the symbolic elites, those who control public discourse in the media, in politics, in education, in science, and so on, that the symbolic elites are most responsible for this particular kind of reproduction of forms of oppression, marginalization, and so on. That is extremely important. They control the discourse, and these discourses partly also control the minds of people. When you control public discourse, you also control public minds. That's very important. So that was the study I began in the 1980s, and many of the theories are now today much more sophisticated with the help of many people in many countries. We now know much more about this, and this idea that the symbolic elites, those who control public discourse, have such a prominent role, I would like to emphasize today, because it is still valid today. Later in the discussion, we may see if, for example, the emergence of the social media has changed that. People would say, no, this is not only the symbolic elites who now have access to the public mind, the public cognition, but also many other people. And the point is, if that is really true in the sense that they are a majority, if not maybe the symbolic elites through the powerful institutions which exist, still have a very important way of controlling other people. I also have been working in the 1980s on the analysis of news, and that time very little work was done on discourse analysis of news. Today, that's a very important aspect of critical discourse studies. Again, if today we are talking about notions like fake news, we first have to know what news is. And I think for the analysis of fake news, we also need a good theory of news production, news comprehension, and especially how it is possible that people, although well educated, are reading, selecting, and comprehending and accepting fake news. So just the notion of fake news, which is now a very popular notion with many books published, what I am interested in is a profound analysis in many disciplines of what that exactly it means. So one of the things I would like to stress, for example, is that fake news is not just the news we now read in the social media. There have been lots of fake news many years in the tabloids. For example, the tabloids I studied in the 1980s, writing about immigrants, they produced a lot of fake news about immigrants until today. So fake news is nothing new. Fake news we have been having for many years. Another topic I would like to emphasize is the notion of ideology. As you well know, ideology has been studied in many disciplines, especially in philosophy and the social sciences, since Marx, Engels, and many others more than 100 years ago. The funny thing is that although in psychology, for example, we learn a lot about the structure of the mind, for example, about the structure of knowledge and so on and so on. If you go into psychology or even cognitive social psychology, there's virtually no study of what ideologies are. So I wrote a book about it at the end of the 1990s, which was just for me an introduction to explore what it is. Now, cognitively speaking, obviously ideologies are here in the heads of people. But what the structures are of these ideologies, for example, the kind of ideologies which are at the basis of Holocaust denial, or racism denial, or sexism denial, and other kinds of denials, we have to know what the structure of these ideologies are and how they are related to other structures of the mind, attitudes we have, for example, about immigration, or many other aspects which are crucial topics in everyday life. Another point very much important, which I already mentioned, is the work I began to do. All this is just beginning, in the sense that we need many more books to treat this particular kind of thing. So one of my last books is about knowledge and discourse. And again, until I started to write that book, I had no idea myself how much knowledge is crucial to understand and to produce discourse. Knowledge is everywhere at all levels in discourse, not only in presuppositions and definite articles and many other grammatical structures. Knowledge is everywhere in discourse. Without a fundamental comprehension of knowledge, we simply don't know how discourse works. It's extremely important in communication, in everyday conversation, in talk, and so on and so on. I urge many people, especially if you're interested in fake news and distortion, you cannot understand what this is all about if you don't know what knowledge is and how knowledge is being shared in epistemic communities. That is very important. Another notion which I thought is also very important and which was also a long time ignored is the notion of context. So one of the things I also would like to stress is we, of course, are typically in discourse studies and linguistics focusing on the actual text, talk, messages, and so on. But crucial, not only for pragmatics and other disciplines, is also the communicative context. Who is speaking, when, where, for whom, with what goal, and so on and so on. If you want to understand and explain speech acts, if you understand style, if you want to understand rhetoric, many uses of language, anything which has to do with the appropriateness of discourse, you have to know what context is. And my point in these books I did on context is the following, namely, that context is not out there. That is very typical. You have here the text and context is somewhere else. My point is that context is not something objectively out there. Context is something which we have in our minds as well. We have in our minds mental models of all kinds of situations and also of communicative situations. So when you're speaking with someone or writing an email message or participating in a, for example, this particular session, all of you at this moment have in your mind a mental model of the communicative situation. Who is speaking, as what, in what kind of situation, with what goals, and so on. And many of the structures of discourse depend on that particular kind of context as we construe it subjectively in our mind. But each person has a different kind of mental model of the communicative situation with different goals, different knowledge, different aims, different identities, and so on. All these dimensions of context are here in our mental model of the communicative situation. And many of the aspects of discourse, especially, you know, from linguistics, like intexical expression, deictic expressions, and many more pronouns, depend on our mental model of the communicative situation. They control everything we say, and especially how we say it, to whom, when, and where. So that is very important. Now, just to mention the last phase of this development, and I'm mixing now a little bit of personal history also with theory. After my books since the 1980s on racist discourse, I would like to emphasize a next phase, for me at least, in the study of critical discourse analysis, that is not just studying dominant discourse, not just the study of power abuse, but also all forms of resistance. It is crucially important that we should not just study racist discourse, but also anti-racist discourse, and not just sexist discourse, but also feminist discourse, and so on. So I think, and I would like to emphasize that critical discourse studies is not just about power abuse and domination, but also about resistance. People who are in opposed situations, including us as critical discourse analysts, we also have a voice in that resistance against all kinds of abuses and also specific kind of discursive abuses. So my last books are on the history, and that's the first time I am writing on history, which is for me very important because so far different, for example, from my colleague Ruth Wodak, who has been working on history of anti-Semitic and racist discourse for many, many years. I had never worked on the historical dimension. So what I did for several years was to study how in history people have been resisting racism in Europe and in the United States and in Brazil. And especially, of course, in the work people and the publications of people against slavery in many countries. So the first anti-racist discourses in many countries were against racism, and then later also in the 20th century against all forms of racism, as we know also in, for example, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter in the United States, and the same thing in, for example, anti-Semitism. So one of the chapters of one of these books is specifically the history of how people, especially Jewish people in the 19th century in Europe, resisted the first beginnings of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic discourse, which had an influence until precisely the Holocaust in the 20th century. So if you read the history of the resistance against anti-Semitism, you see how different kind of structures remain active until today, how not only anti-Semitic discourse was for more than 100 years popular already in Germany, but also how many scholars, many of whom are now forgotten in, for example, in Germany and other countries, were resisting and analyzing in a very detailed way what the structures and strategies were of this particular kind of anti-Semitic discourse. I just already mentioned that I am not a specialist on the Holocaust denial. But many of the structures involved there and the denial of oppression are very old structures which already were there, especially, for example, with Protestant professors in Germany after 1815. And after the defeat of Napoleon and against the French Revolution and so on. So there was already in the 19th century already a tradition of undemocratic, illiberal discourses, and against which many, especially also Jewish scholars, already from then until the 20th century, with work of Hannah Arendt and many others, already were formulating these kind of things. So I was learning a lot about the fact that many of the kinds of struggle today we have in critical discourse analysis already existed in Brazil, in the United States, in Europe, and many other countries to resist this particular kind of racism. Now, to round this kind of theoretical dimensions, I think are very important. I've just mentioned what I'm working in now because that is hardly published. So that's at least one thing you can't know yet, namely that I've been working especially also on the discourse of social movements. So already these books on anti-racist discourse were framed in the theory of discourses of social movements. So I'm interested in how social movements talk among themselves, how they communicate, how they produce leaflets, manifestos, and many other kinds of things. So at this moment, I'm beginning to write some papers and also a book, which is simply called Social Movement Discourse, and which is about all the dimensions of discourse which are relevant specifically for people in social movements. And the anti-racist movements and the abolition movement and the anti-racist movement in various countries are just examples of this particular kind of social movement. And to apply this also to a situation of today, I specifically focus on the people who have been assisting refugees in Western Europe. So I wanted to know, we suddenly have what in Europe and the rest of the world was called the refugee crisis, which rather was a political crisis of Europe. And I'm interested in how people, ordinary people, men and women, especially women, were active helping people at train stations, at borders and so on, with clothes and food and shelter and so on. So I'm very much interested in that particular book to apply to the situation of today, namely how refugees in Europe are welcomed in an atmosphere where the prejudices against refugees are very, very dominant in many, many, many countries. And not just in poor countries who have no money to support them, specifically, and that's another thing we need to explain, in rich countries in Northern Europe, in my own country, in Holland, in Germany, in Scandinavian countries, in England, where many, many official policies and people with lots of power, the tabloids I just mentioned already, have been against refugees since a long time. And much of the work I did on racism in the media many, many years ago apply today still, and not just in the tabloids, but also, of course, in social media. So much of this work is relevant until today. And my point now is this, that not only all of us should do this critical analysis of social media and everyday media, traditional media, but also to be solidary with the few people who go out and fight and struggle against this particular kind of thing. So the people who are anti-racist, the people who are helping refugees, and people who, wherever in the world, are participating in social movements, in NGOs and so on. They appear to be many, but if you compare to the majority in parliaments in many countries, I'm afraid so far we have not much to say. So this is just a brief mention of some of my own work and how it is related today. Now, what I would like to emphasize today is the following. That, of course, each of us are interested in our specific area of linguistics, social linguistics, cognitive linguistics, social analysis, pragmatics, and all the fields of discourse we have. But what I would like to emphasize today for you especially, is not given another introduction to the theory of my theory of discourse studies, but to say, what can we do today in discourse studies for the major international problems? I think that's extremely important, that we should not just continue as usual, what the politicians already do and what most scholars also do. We should ask ourselves, what can we do at this moment to critically analyze and contribute to the fundamental problems of today? I will just mention things, and that, of course, for all of you, that is just obvious, but it still needs to be mentioned. First of all, of course, the climate disaster. I'm not saying climate change because it's already an under describing what is happening. There's a climate disaster which is relevant for all people. So we should ask how, for example, work in critical discourse study is also being relevant for this particular kind of thing, especially, and since denial is a keyword today, also people who are denying this particular kind of thing. So I just read yesterday or today, I think in The Guardian, that the denial of climate change is diminishing, what does not mean that there is no, in many, many websites and many social media, there is still a lot of diminishing, euphemizing the climate disaster, which is of course relevant for all people. Another thing I would like to mention again for you, all of you, especially people in the global south, extremely relevant. I would like to emphasize the following. We have many books now on racism and now also on anti-racism. We have many books on sexism. We have studies of Me Too. We have many ways of the way women are being discriminated in the world. But there's practically no study in discourse analysis, discourse study about poverty. So we have in our Center of Discourse Studies here in Barcelona, we have many books on many topics, but there is virtually no section of books on how poverty is being studied also from a discourse point of view. This work of my colleagues in Latin America, for example, in Brasilia, colleagues of mine who are especially interested in the discourse about homeless people. But this is just one dimension, but there are many other forms of poverty in the world, incredible poverty. And we don't have to read the studies of Piketty in France about capital to know that since the 1960s, especially since the 1980s, the rich people are getting much richer and the poor people get more poorer and poorer. And I think it's extremely important for each of you, especially if students are listening to me, not just study the traditional way of doing critical discourse analysis, but going out there and see in many ways how the discourse about poor people is having an influence on policies, national policies, and so on. One of the typical strategies, as you well know, is blaming the victim. They are themselves guilty of not working hard enough, not searching for a job, not modernizing, and so on and so on. Blaming the victim is one of the fundamental strategies of the discourse about poverty. So I think it's extremely important for hundreds of millions of people in the world that we also in critical discourse study much more discourses about all kinds of dimensions of poverty. Who is poor? What are the causes of poverty? What is being done about it? And so on and so on. That's very important. I already mentioned, but I have to repeat again, also extremely important as a fundamental problem we should deal with much more is, of course, all kinds of sexism, machismo, patriarchy, and so on, relevant for all women, for all men and women, especially women. Happily, also for the journals we edit, there are many, many women contributing papers on all these aspects of sexism in all dimensions of everyday life. This still remains extremely important. I'm very happy that many, many women in scholars in many disciplines are working on this. There are disciplines, congresses, journals, and so on who work on this. Also, from the perspective of critical discourse analysis, I already mentioned the work of Ruth Wodak, but there are many other women in critical discourse study. One woman I would like to mention, especially in Southeast Asia, my colleague and friend, Michelle Azar in Singapore, who has been propagating also what she called feminist critical discourse studies. For all of you who are interested in the role of women in critical discourse studies, that is very, very important hierarchy. I already mentioned structural poverty, but also, of course, classism. That again, together with poverty, classism is something we need to understand much more about. And many people, like, for example, Norman Fairclough and others in Britain, have been studying that perspective of this critical discourse study. That simply remains a very important thing. So besides poverty, everything which has to do with classism against working people and so on is also extremely important. Today, if I make a list of these fundamental major international problems, many of you have been reading a lot about populism and the extreme right. A colleague of mine and compatriot, Klaus Mudder, who works now in the United States, is writing about this he has very good books. He also publishes articles in the Guardian and so on. He and many others have been writing about what populism is. But again, we are critical discourse study. If anything is relevant for discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis, it's populist discourse. And I'm happy to say that many people are now studying this particular kind of thing. But there are also many misconceptions. Populism very often is associated with people, with ordinary people, as if populism is an invention of poor people. Again, this is one of these typical strategy is blaming the victim. My point and my thesis also today, I'd like to repeat, is that populism and also populist discourse is basically also coming from the elite, the extreme right. This is not just an invention of poor people, so we should not blame the poor, or people have no jobs, and so on and so on. Populism is a typical discourse invented, as we say in Spanish, arriba, you know, up there. It's very important that populism is formulated and pre-formulated by the symbolic elites at the extreme right in many, many countries. So this is the kind of people who have access, broad access to the internet, who have websites, who have extreme right journals and so on, radios and televisions in many countries, because precisely these extreme right elites are studied, especially also by Ruth Waldeck in Vienna, are something we need to understand much more about. So to understand populism, it is not just a question of analyzing what everyday people say, even on social media. We are much more to understand how social media work. We first have to know how the symbolic elites at the right and extreme right have control of the social media. So if you want to study especially manipulation, fake news, ignorance and denial, and we already spoke mentioned several times the forms of denial of the Holocaust, denial of racism, denial of climate change, and so on and so on. This is extremely important. We should know, if we want to study, for example, questions of manipulation, fake news and ignorance and so on, and especially if I mention the social media, again, it's crucial that we study and criticize, which has happily been done lately very often on Facebook and so on, and fake news also in other media, and incredible ignorance about the causes, for example, of the current pandemic and so on. If you just think about the relationship between structures of discourse at all levels, the main topics, the metaphors, even the structure of sentences, but also storytelling, also argumentation, all these levels and dimensions of discourse you all know so well. We need to study, but again, we have to study them also in relationship to the mind. But as soon as we talk about denial, it's denial of knowledge, denial of scientific knowledge. We talk about fake news. What does it mean? That again, these are lies against what is knowledge which can be shared through other media. I mentioned just the word of manipulation. I'm not an expert, but I wrote a couple of papers on manipulation. And again, how can you define what manipulation is? Now, manipulation obviously is mostly discursive. Manipulation is mostly discursive. But what happens in manipulation? You are manipulating the minds of people. You're manipulating their knowledge. You're manipulating their attitudes about important social issues. You are fundamentally manipulating their ideologies. But people can say, well, that happens also in education. When I'm as a professor, I teach students, I'm trying to influence you as well. I'm trying to manipulate your mind, right? Now, what is the difference between education, teaching, and so on one hand, and manipulation? How do we define this difference? That's not so easy, because yes, we are in a way also manipulating through all kinds of things, like, for example, Zoom sessions like this one. We are trying to manipulate many people. Now, how do we distinguish that particular kind of manipulation from the kind of manipulation you now see in the social media when it comes to social differences, exclusion, forms of racism, and so on, and denials? How do we distinguish them? Now, there is one dimension, but that's just one dimension, which needs to be analyzed much more. And that is that the manipulation is always controlling the mind of people in the interest of the person who is manipulating, and not in the interest of the people who are being manipulated. It has to do with for whom does it serve? For whom is it good? So manipulation is discourse controlling the minds of other people in the interest of the person who is manipulating. And it can be governments, it can be big companies and so on, and not in the interest of other people. So we also should analyze in structures of manipulation, whom does it serve? I mean, that I think is very, very important. So I think that this kind of critical discourse studies, looking at major international problems, I just mentioned a few, also those which have directly to do with our field, namely all kinds of public discourse. So that is extremely important. And not just only the social media, which has lots of influence. There's lots of articles in the press today. You also, if you follow the news, for example, about Facebook. Of course, this is terrible, especially when we know that more than 1 million people are using it. But we should not forget all these everyday newspapers where similar things happen. I mean, don't forget that tabloid newspapers, even today, I still have millions of readers. And that happens in Britain, it happens in Germany, and so on. And many of these newspapers are still lying about immigration, lying about refugees, lying about what happens in the rest of the world, and especially ignoring lots of fundamental things which happen in the rest of the world where people never read about. Or they will present in Europe, for example, all the good things people in Europe are doing for all these poor countries, and again, without much criticism. So I think that there are many aspects of critical discourse studies today which can be applied not only in criticizing fundamentally Twitter and Facebook and so on, but also don't forget our normal media, our normal textbooks. One of the dimensions of critical discourse studies so far I hardly mentioned, I talked about political discourse, analyzing what happens in our parliaments and what our politicians say. What happens in media, any kind of media, traditional media, but also social media, but also education. What happens in the classroom? I mean, one of the fundamental things I've been interested in since a long time is also textbooks. What do we read in textbooks? In the 1980s, I wrote one of my first books in critical discourse studies was a critical study of textbooks in social science and history in the Netherlands, and what they told them, the students, on immigration. That was incredible. It is a little bit better today, but if you look at textbooks around the world, what is being sold as official knowledge needs a critical analysis anywhere in any country. So I would, those of you who are interested in education, think about the curriculum and how critical discourse analysis can be applied there, and also in textbooks. There's lots of work we can do about that. So what can we do? I've just summarized, and I'm not going to enter in details. We can reply to practical questions afterwards. I would say, first of all, what can we do as critical discourse students? First of all, always formulate opposition academically, socially, and politically to all forms of domination, power abuse. So power abuse, I'm not so much interested in power, I'm interested in power abuse, in domination. So all forms of opposition through our work of critical discourse study. Second, we should continue to analyze, to criticize, and to resist all forms of specifically discursive domination. And we should also provide critical analysis and explanation. And because we can simply say, oh, there are a lot of people saying terrible things about minorities or about immigrants and so on, but we also not only should analyze what they say, we also need to explain it. Why is it so that in so many countries, also here in Europe, for example, so many people are saying these terrible things about minorities, refugees, Jews, and so on? Why is it rising today? Why? So the notion of explaining also as discourse analysts, linguists, and so on is very, very important. And we should not only leave this to philosophers or social scientists, we also have our way to contribute this particular kind of understanding. We should, of course, educate our students as future teachers and the future symbolic elites. It's extremely important that in education, we should also integrate these particular kind of things. In a few weeks in Barcelona, I'm starting a masterclass in discourse analysis, and it's extremely important for me, and many of the students from all over the world, it's important for me that I try to translate complex theoretical things also in the education of students. We should do critical analysis and renewal of textbooks. If any kind of practical thing you want to do is look at the textbooks of your own university, of your own discipline, look at them. And of course, the critical analysis of all media is also very important. And of course, always in solidarity with other critical groups and organizations. So, and how do you do this particular critical discourse analysis? Let me just summarize quickly. For example, first of all, you have to identify a major problem so that where CDA and CDS can make a difference. We have to develop a sophisticated multidisciplinary theory. It's not just a question. It's not just a question of a little bit superficial theory, but it should be a sophisticated theory. We have to relate discourse structures with social structure through cognitive structures. We should improve and develop sophisticated methods. So all levels of discourse, grammar, rhetoric, style, argumentation, storytelling, communicative context, epistemic analysis, ideological analysis, multimodal analysis also of images, and so on and so on. At all these levels of discourse analysis, we can begin to study critically what are the main problems today. I already have talked too much. There's much more to say, but I'd rather give you the floor. And I hope that if you can't ask questions today, you're always welcome to write me at my email. And as everyone knows, I always reply to all my questions. Sorry, I already speak too much.
Thank you very much. It's so inspiring to hear all this, and especially for me coming from literature. I think that we're now like giving you a virtual round of applause in our hearts, you know, sending to you. Coming from literary studies, to know that you've been inspired by your time studying literature, and you know, studying literature is also, you know, when you do this textual analysis, you consider all the words, all sentences or phrases, you know, thoroughly in ways that pave the way to the kind of work that you're doing right now. And I love the word that you use, you know, solidarity, because this is very important. I mean, in the world where I would say that we see symbolic elites everywhere, even in of course, I cannot say even in academia, you know, for example, people would say, but research should be above politics, you know, literature and linguistics should be above politics. These two things should be divorced, you know. Some of the, for example, funding committees would say, oh, but your research should not have this tinge, this political tinge in it, you know. And this is very, for me, this is, I have always been against this sort of notion. I think that research is political, and it should be, and we should actually show our solidarity to those who are empowered, who do not have power, who are actually subjected to a power abuse. So to hear that from you is really, really inspiring indeed. So thank you very much. I think what we will do is that the organizer of this symposium has sent me the first question to kickstart the session, and then we will go through some of the questions that were sent to us. So since our symposium focuses on different instances of Holocaust denial, genocide denial, and I know that you said that you're not an expert, but for sure your work kind of like contributes to our better understanding, I would say, of Holocaust denial and genocide denial. We would just ask for your opinion. What do you perceive to be the main specificity or specific traits or specific characteristics, in your opinion, of Holocaust and genocide denial compared to other forms of hate speech?
Verita, thank you again for your question. First of all, if I may, because you use the word hate speech, and some of people who have been listening to me these last year, I would like to say that I don't like that notion. And I explain why. Hate speech is an idea that there is hate, or which means some kind of emotion. Mm-hmm. And emotions, you can say, people don't control. It is something which comes to people. They're overcome by emotion. It's like something which is spontaneous. And hate speech has nothing to do with emotion. Hate speech has to do with power and power abuse. That's fundamental. So hate speech against Jews already many, many centuries, and hate speech against refugees or minorities in Southeast Asia and so on and so on. That's nothing which has to do with a spontaneous feeling against them. Some people may have in some situation. So in the theory of emotion, an emotion is something ad hoc of one person in one specific situation. It can be measured. And that is not the case. It has nothing to do with people being furious. The people who caused the Holocaust, they were not overcome with emotions. They had no feelings about Jews at all. I mean, the fundamental thing is they treat them like animals. And even the metaphors in the discourses are very important. So instead of hate speech, I would love, it's too late now because it's now a very popular notion. I would love to use other words like discriminating discourse or dominating discourse. It's very important to know that hate speech is not about hate. It's not about hate, it's about power. It's about domination. It's about abuse of power. So that's the first kind of thing. So if you want to study Holocaust denial or any kind of genocide denial and so on, again, it has nothing, for me, it has nothing to do with emotion. It has to do with power and power abuse, namely that a specific kind of group doesn't want to admit others being human, admit them to their country or in their family and so on and so on. It has to do with exclusion. It has to be dehumanization and so on and so on. So if you analyze these particular kinds of hate speech, these dominant discourses, you have to look at this particular kind of thing. Whom, again, does it? Now, that's one thing. And the other thing is who is responsible for this particular kind of hate speech? Again, as I just mentioned, hate speech is associated with ordinary people who write ordinary messages in Facebook. No, I don't think so. This particular kind of people are writing these kind of things because they have heard and read specific kind of thing. Let me mention another part of the theory, which is also applicable to the analysis of Holocaust denial. Racism and sexism and so on is not innate. It is learned, okay? It's learned. And it's learned mostly through all kinds of public discourse, through the media, television, books, social media today, and how these influence, for example, parents or colleagues and friends. So through this particular kind of thing. So all these so racism and sexism, and therefore also anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, all these things are being learned through all kinds of discourses circulating. Just have to read the work of Ruth Wodak on anti-Semitism to see also historically where these discourses come from. You know, they were circulating in Europe for many, many centuries. And these particular kind of analysis come again through specific kind of symbolic elites. I am not interested how in the 19th century in Germany, for example, were laid the groundwork of anti-Semitism, which led to the Holocaust. The people who did that were professors of universities. They were Protestant professors who not only were against the French Revolution and its ideas after the defeat of Napoleon. They were Protestant professors, etc., and people who had power in universities and were influencing students. It comes from the symbolic elites. So if you do an analysis of the origins of Holocaust denial, you should look there. I think that's extremely important. Whom you're going to analyze, what kind of things you're going to analyze, and see all these myths and lies, distortions at all levels of discourse in the number game. One of the parts of the Holocaust denial, the 1.6 million and so on, this kind of number game denial and so on. There are many dimensions of Holocaust and ethnic minority and genocide denial who have these aspects of false argumentations, false use of numbers, attribute things to them. They were themselves guilty. For example, one of the aspects is the Jews did not defend themselves well enough, and so on. There are many, forms of lies and distortion of argumentation, data which were only half true, and so on and so on. So if you do an analysis, which I haven't done, I only did that for all the strategies, everyday racism denial in an old paper of the 1990s, which is on my website. You find the strategies, how do you deny racism in everyday life? So, but it's very important, again, to know where you are looking. And it's very important, Verita, that you ask these questions and insist on this. I wish I could say a little bit more. I only have so little done in this particular area. I can only talk about some aspects.
Thank you very much, and such humbleness as well. And this, I think you have answered the question that a participant from Indonesia also, well, using the term hate speech, also asked, I think, so we can forward the full question to Professor Van Dijk later. So, but now I want to move on to this particular question that I find might stimulate our talk. And this is a question which says, there have been many issues when it comes to using CDA as a research methodology, mostly due to selecting and using only a small number of texts, leading to concerns of cherry-picking data. And the citation is Sriratana and Seeley. How can we then promote CDA as a reliable research methodology and framework? This is from the audience.
I know. It's very well known, and it has been around for many, many years. I'm always interested only who formulate this particular kind of criticism. Why is that problem, about suddenly this worry about method, which other kinds of scholars never have? If you do grammatical analysis, do people say we are interested in cherry picking this particular kind of example? It doesn't happen. So first of all, one always not only should analyze what happens, but also where it comes from. Why is it that suddenly critical discourse analysis has to show things which other aspects of discourse analysis never asks about? That's one thing. So you always have to ask who asks. That's very important. And the second thing is the question of cherry picking. Well, you all know that today critical discourse analysis is extremely well associated with all kinds of forms of corpus linguistics, which is counting a lot, much more than traditional content analysis. And one can say, of course, that's not good enough. You also have to do a qualitative, just counting words and frequencies is very important, but it's only one part of the thing. Now, and then the question of cherry picking. Of course, if we do this particular kind of analysis, say, typical of racist discourse is this and this and this and this kind of thing, and you do a detailed analysis of some examples, it doesn't say, for example, that this is not happening. You say, this is typical. I give you just an example. What you have to learn is how it works. And then if you know how it works, it's easy to say how often it works. For example, I did a book many years ago, 1991, but it's exactly now, how many? 30 years ago. I'm getting old. So 30 years ago, in a book called Racism in the Press, I did an analysis of all these structures of racism in the press, but it also were lots of numbers. So again, it's false. Many people working in critical discourse analysis also do offer actual data. So that's extremely important. There's no corpus linguistics using this kind of thing with all its limitations. But if you study structures, just frequencies of words, you don't know what the structure of propositions and the other structure of discourse are. You cannot just count, for example, complex syntactic structures or complex narrative or argumentation structures. And there's another point very important to say, which I always use also when we talk about race, and people would say, well, this is just one newspaper or one editorial saying these kind of terrible things. But if this is done by an important newspaper, by an important politician, he or she can say only one terrible thing against immigrants and minorities and refugees, and it will have an influence on millions. So even if you do a critical analysis of the syntax of that and that politician or that newspaper or that particular kind of thing, the influence it has on millions of people, again, we come back again, where do all these things come from? It comes again from the influence of the symbolic elites. So even if you do just a critical analysis of one tabloid, of one editorial, and the editorial is read by so many people in parliament who take decisions about limitation of immigration, you can follow the whole sequence, how it works. I've done that. I've looked at parliamentary debates and how they use the press to argue against immigration, for example. It's just one people speaking, all right? So yes, the qualitative analysis of crucial texts in public discourse is extremely important to do that. And you cannot just do that. And all these particular kind of analysis are always replicable. I'm not giving a personal interpretation of poetry as we did in the old days. No, this is a systematic analysis of this particular kind of structures, and anyone can follow them. So the methods are so reliable that it's not just a personal impression or so. So about this whole question of cherry picking, I have a lot to say, but not today.
Thank you very much. I think since you mentioned symbolic elites, we have this very interesting question. It says, could you please, interesting request, so could you please clarify what you mean by symbolic elites and how their role changes in the age of social media? How can the structuring agency of, for example, Facebook and its community standards for discourse be understood? So symbolic elites, please.
Okay, the notion of symbolic elites has a little bit of a relationship also with sociology. So if you think about symbolic power, if you think of the work of Bourdieu and France, it is related to this particular kind of thing. So I use the symbolic elites or these terms, all people who have control over public discourse in a multimedia kind of way. So images, film, movies, Facebook, not just text, okay? So symbolic elites, and I'm thinking who in fact controls in our societies this kind of public discourse in a broad sense. So also media messages and so on. Now, first of all, the media, all kinds of media, social media, traditional media, newspaper, radio, television, all media which are today there, that's one. Second, who controls also public discourse? The politicians who say, who repeat many of the things to the media and so on. And also the third element, of course, are education and science. So what can be said and what is being said in society is mostly controlled by the symbolic elites. So in symbolic elites are those influential people and institutions, schools, academies, politicians, and so on, who control what is being said and read. What most of you know about the rest of the world, what I know of what is happening in the world about the pandemic at this moment, how do I know? Practically 90% or more through the media. Most of what I know, again, I know through textbooks, books, and so on, again, of the symbolic elites. So the symbolic elites dominate and control all kinds of public discourse in a broad sense. And now, and then the question, I already mentioned it briefly, is what with the social media? Again, if you're with the social media, you can say, okay, any idiot can write something in social media and it will be read by millions. I still need to see, and I'm ignorant about that. I don't know the empirical work about the actual influence of all aspects we talk about of the social media. If we have empirical data about the influence about specific kinds of things which is being said in social media, I would have more data to explain. But my point is that many of the things which are being said in the media are not just originally invented by people. They get them from somewhere. As I said, racism is not innate. It is being learned by people through the public discourses. And my point is that most of the kinds of racist, anti-Semitic, sexist things which are spread and formulated in the social media, they are not original. They get them also from other kinds of discourses. That's one thing. And the social media are not just social media of individual people, individual influencers. They're also social media of famous newspapers, organizations, institutions, and so on. Again, these are not popular media in that sense. So I still need to see what the original contribution is, in which, for example, the social media follow or don't follow, criticize or don't criticize the symbolic elites. And my hunch, and that not only began in my book on the elite discourse and racism, where I said it mostly comes from above and not from downstairs, from below. And I think that most of what we read negatively in the social media is simply a popular voice giving to many kinds of elite discourse. That's a thesis. And I have seen it for racism. I've seen it confirmed many, many times. I'm not an expert because we don't even have the data today in the influence of the social media. And yes, we need to revise maybe or improve the theory of symbolic elites with the influence of the social media. But my thesis is still that even in social media, the real influence is from the symbolic elites and not from ordinary people.
Thank you very much. For me personally, CDA helped me very much to understand and to analyze, epistemic violence, because it's the form propagated, but very hard to pinpoint, especially in the framework of law. And you mentioned structural poverty, and I don't know if anyone here has watched the Netflix series called Maid. It's about a single mother, and she had to go through all this structural kind of poverty. It's such a good series for that, and to kind of as a feminist, to rethink equality not only on the basis of the de jure equality but also de facto equality. So I think that it's what you said is very inspiring, and we need to actually go back and maybe identify the symbolic elites and the production of knowledge.
Verita,
yes.
Because you mentioned the movie, precisely for those people most of the people listening today are not from Latin America, but let me just, I go there, as many of you know, I helped also to constitute an organization in Latin America called ALED, you know, the Asociación Latinoamericana de Estudio del Discurso. So I go a lot to Latin America, so I also know what happens there. My wife is from Brazil, so I'm informed constantly what's happening in Brazil. And since you mentioned two movies precisely on top poverty and class, so there's an excellent movie in Brazil about the everyday life of a maid, and another one in Chile about the same topic. So the two famous movies in Latin America precisely about the everyday life of a maid and how she is being treated in middle and upper class homes in Brazil and in Chile. And I've seen it happening myself. I've been there in all these countries of Latin America. I've been there, I've been invited by friends and colleagues. And I have seen how, for example, children of these rich families ask the maid to get her a glass of water from the kitchen. You know, this kind of thing, which for me, as coming from Holland, was hallucinating, which doesn't mean that these things don't happen in Holland too, but then in another way. So it's good to mention these movies because it's part also of the kind of critical discourse studies we can do, this form of resistance and opposition against this form of elite racism. Many more people should do movies of this particular kind of situation, should do many more movies against racism, many more movies against all, happily they are, against all forms of sexism, and many more women directors taking the lead. Many of the criticism also done by third world people from the global south today contributing with movies and so on. So there's lots of counter discourse happily coming around. And I just hope that international companies like Netflix and so on contribute more space to that. Yes, please.
Wonderful. We have so many people from the Philippines, and my family's from the Philippines as well. So there are also movies like Babae at Baril, you know, like by Red, you know, that kind of like fits into this description of rewriting violence through the feminist framework. There's so many things to do with movies, right? And I think films is a very good avenue to explore that. And which leads to, okay, another, thank you very much for all the questions. You know, I'm so sorry that I don't know if we have all the time to address all the questions, but please let me try. This one says, many schools around the world try to integrate anti-racist discourse and curriculum in their schools. But in some states in the US, the discourse of critical race theory are problematic. My question is, do you think if we reframe the CRT to anti-racism for children to learn, will the reframing help reduce this resistance from the rightist parents? I understand that CRT and anti-racism share the same goal. The problem is the discourse each camp produces. Thank you.
Okay, this is a very important question. Actually, my last book on published by Cambridge University Press on anti-racist discourse says in the beginning of the book what the theory and the data and history presented here is very much related also, of course, to critical race theory. And I'm in contact with many people in the United States also working in this area. And it's a scandal, as you just mentioned, that critical race theory is now even delegitimized and accused and even forbidden in many parts of the United States. One can see this in a positive way and a negative way. The fact that it's being attacked and prohibited all around means it seems to have influence. If it were totally without any influence, it would not be prohibited in many Republican states and schools and so on. It seems to have influence, and apparently among the younger people who, yes, read Black Lives Matter studies and so on. So the good news is happily, there are many people saying, okay, great, we have this particular kind of analysis. And again, these particular kind of prohibitions, this particular kind of criticism against some data to analyze. I mean, the arguments they use in a school or a state in the United States to forbid critical race studies and so on, there are things also to analyze. And again, they're part of the same problem. They are part of the same problem of racism. It does mean that not only you are against Black people, especially Black people being scholars, Black people being professors, Black people offering insights students might want to learn, and so on. So I'm not saying that educating people in this way, but I do think that if you, from very young on, learn young people to be critical, any kind of any kind of power abuse. It doesn't even have to be about racism and so on in the beginning. But if you learn them, if you teach them to be critical of any form of power abuse, naturally they will also very young, not always, it's not automatic, because the whole rest of their development, their personal experiences, their personal experience in everyday life, how they're being educated in schools, out of school, and so on, is a very complex structure. It's not just discourse which goes to the head of people and there will be automatically critical scholars. Of course not. But you still have to offer all these instruments and so on, which until very late didn't happen. I mean, in the textbooks I analyzed, and the textbook of the 1980s, we're not talking about the 19th century. We're talking about textbooks of a couple of decades ago, which said terrible things about immigrants and minorities. And so until all these textbooks have been rewritten and all the school curricula have been redone, there's still a lot to do. And part of this will be resistant. I mean, the same thing, since Verita, we are talking about this now. Why is there in social media so much anti-Semitism and so much racism and so much sexism and so on? One of the explanations, I'm not trying to be a popular sociologist today, because I'm a critical discourse analyst who wants the data, very precise data, okay? So what I'm saying is that it is not for nothing that there is so much of this around now, because precisely because women have getting more influence, because Black people get more and more a voice, and so on and so on. And many people who cannot identify with this kind of new power distribution react in this particular kind of way. So again, many of these things, the good news is, this is a reaction against the power of gay people, of women, of non-white people, and so on, and so on, and so on. So one of the explanations of what happened is precisely because things are changing. So of course, we need much more political analysis of the causes of populism and so on and so on. But one of them has to do with this particular kind of thing, that the dominant discourse is changing a little bit. Not all newspapers are only racist and so on. What's being said now about gay, Black people, the global South, and so on, is changing a little bit. And that little bit has an influence in all kinds of natural resistance of right-wing symbolic elites who inspire ordinary people through the social media. So there is a way of explaining this particular kind of thing, and it also even has positive dimensions. And we still do have to do this critical analysis of what's now going on.
Thank you very much. There is a question that is very current, that deals with the current situation very much. So can we, this is from the participant, can we also do a critical discourse analysis of vaccine mandate and the narrative behind it?
Thank you for that question, because it's the kind of question I talk about every day with my wife at the dinner table. You know, is it democratic to to force people to be vaccinated, right? And I'm not again, I'm a discourse analyst. I first have to see how it works, how many people say it, where it comes from. The only thing I just wonder is how come that suddenly when governments on the basis of scientific evidence say you should do and not do this, and so for example in Austria at this moment people are on complete lockdown again, and in many countries also in Holland we have all kinds of new rules, and it's everywhere in the world. Now why suddenly this particular kind of recommendations, because it's not even, you know, recommendations or advice and so on, is critically why, for example, this obligation to wear masks and so on is not accepted. But people don't protest against the obligation of paying taxes. They don't pay attention to many other obligations we have in everyday life, that where you should drive on the road, that you should stop for a red light. It's terrible, all these obligations you have in everyday life. Why suddenly, for vaccines, that is this kind of thing, we should not be obliged to do so. In order to avoid accidents in the road, we have red lights. Why is that acceptable and not, for example, to say people, in order to avoid that other people get sick? Not only yourself, but also other people. We have a basic, it has to do with the fundamentals of any kind of society, that you have norms and rules. And one of the norms of rules is that, for example, you should eat and not this. People prohibit companies not to put this kind of poison in food. There's also a prohibition. No one protests against this. So you should see this kind of protest against obligations in a broader sense of sociological, philosophical, anthropological prohibition in society all along. And I find it very strange that precisely for this particular kind of thing, there is this kind of conspiracies, protests. People in Holland, in Rotterdam, go to see protest against this kind of obligation. Why? Suddenly, is the state so powerful that we need to, there's so many other things, much more important things we should protest against. And if it's, you know, if you think about philosophical notion about the common good, if you can show, and scholars and scientists, not only in biology and medicine, but also in communication, in discourse, in public opinion, and so on, they should also be involved in communicating these kind of things and explain to people, listen, when you were small, you had no problem, of course, or your parents had no problem that you had to be vaccinated against these childhood illnesses. What's your problem today? And so on. I mean, this is just an informal reaction to something which is going on now. And I have many questions for an analysis which have to be done in a more systematic manner. But it's extremely relevant. And as I say, with my family, I also talk about it every day.
Thank you. I think some of the countries in Southeast Asia have quite a different problem, especially one particular country that I know, Thailand. I think anti-vaxxers are not the issue, but the mismanagement of vaccine and vaccine policy, which we cannot even talk about. There's like censoring bodies everywhere. I should not talk about that as well, but we should name. I think as CDA scholars or literary scholars or whatever we do. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'd like to direct, since we're on, you just talked about we talk about the vaccine mandate. What comes with the discourses we see online, is also troll-generated comments. And this particular question is fascinating. Let me read. I've always felt that troll-generated comments may be a threat to the validity of CDA when passing through social media content. Do we know how to discriminate these from authentic discourse, or do we embrace it as part of the discourse to be analyzed?
It's a complex question. Also, I don't have a direct answer because this kind of how to do that. Yes, it is something should be analyzed. One of the things which I would like to emphasize, which is with and behind this question, is this. If you have notions like fake news and so on, distortions, it presupposes that there is some kind of objective truth, that someone knows everything and so on, and all these other things are just deviations from the real thing. That, of course, is complicated because one of the counter discourses is we should have more confidence in science and not in what some kind of influencer is saying. And relevant also for state policies are what science has done. Now, the first thing I'm going to say, if you look at the history of politics and the history of racism, much of the politics in the past have been based on scientific research. You know, many things in genetic policies in Brazil and many other countries and so on, they were based on science. So in that sense, people are right to be critical of that. So how can you distinguish, let's say, scientific consensus today of the history of the abuse of science and its influence in politics? That's a rightful question to do, and therefore we also have to show why and how today the advice of the WHO is a relevant advice and not just some kind of prejudice, cloaked in science. So yes, it's true that we have to do this particular kind of analysis. Another thing which is important to mention also is a piece of fake news in the press on purely formal grounds cannot be distinguished from truthful news. That's why lies work. People can lie, and there's nothing in a lie which distinguishes it from a truthful statement. That's why people can lie, because it's not obvious that it's a lie. You know, a lie seems right. So much of this fake news is like real news because there's no structural, so big of the problem. That's why there is not a real program, which, for example, we can just apply to, for example, Facebook and say, distinguish all these things which are fake news from real news. There is no such thing. So certain kind of things are typical of, people who work with Facebook, and there are hundreds of studies about that. So this particular kind of thing, but there's not a general rule which can distinguish between lies and truthful statement. That's unfortunately true. So you have to know things. And for example, one of the things is you have to have truthful sources. You have to know whom are you read. So I read specific kind of newspapers and I believe them more than other ones because I know what is there is more likely to be true. That's one thing. So that's extremely important that you look at what kind of sources. And it's one of the things which I have to mention here, and I don't like to philosophize on social media. But one of the most incredible things is that anyone in principle can write anything for an immense public of millions of people. Now that is something which I have to think about. Is that real democracy or not? Does it mean that any crackpot can say anything and can thus influence millions of people? Now I have to think about the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech and many, many things when I think about this particular kind of thing. Why to begin a newspaper? To begin a newspaper, you have to have all kinds of licenses. Why have all these people don't need licenses to communicate anything to 1 million people? Let's think about that too, and a broad discussion about freedom of the press and so on, which of course I defend also because otherwise I could not publish my website and so on. So yes, but we have to think about it.
Thank you very much. And to continue the conversation, I mean, yes, there is such danger in the fact that everybody can publish and propagate information. And there is also maybe perhaps an empowering, like you said, empowering channel. It can be used as an empowering channel in that, so many things that we've learned regarding the news. I think now many people are so cynical and they don't want to follow the so-called mainstream news, especially in the country that I know very well. And so investigative journalism coming from like various, I would say, amateur and even professional, journalists also help inform us in a way as well. So maybe, yes, we should take perhaps that into consideration as well. It can be an empowering tool as well, right?
I have something to say about that, Verita, if I may.
Please.
Many of you probably have read the news about the elections in Chile. And in Chile, just the person who has, in the elections of last Sunday, got most vote is someone not only of the extreme right, but he is an explicit fascist, son of a Nazi person coming from Germany, and the kind of ideas he has are not just conservative, they are just extreme. And how to explain this particular kind of thing, despite the dictatorship? How can someone dare still say to be like Pinochet and so on? How come? Also because because in Chile, for example, there's not a single leftist progressive newspaper. There are smaller things, there are websites and so on, and social media, but it's just one dominant big newspaper, El Mercurio, for example, who is also a right-wing newspaper, who also was or is Pinochetista and so on. That's one thing. The same thing in Brazil, a country where I go often, about which I know a lot. How come that millions of people voted for Bolsonaro? How come? Through the hate speech against the Partido de Trabalhadores, against Lula and so on and so on. And I did a systematic analysis a few years ago of the editorials of a major newspaper in Brazil called El Globo, when the former president Dilma Rousseff was impeached. And I showed how through these editorials, massive people were motivated to go on the street and protest against Dilma Rousseff, which also was used in parliament to impeach her. So you said now we need, truthful media and so on. I have many examples where the traditional media were causes and are causes today of terrible things happen. The fact that Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, that Trump was elected in the United States, and so on, and so on, and so on. Also things in Europe is also because of radio, television, and newspapers who have this influence, incredible influence, through also the social media on many, many people. And what we need, yes, much more, is investigative journalism everywhere. We have The Intercept, we have many other organizations and things in the world. Each country should have, by definition, also progressive, critical, independent newspapers, television stations, and so on. And unfortunately, they are not in the majority.
Thank you. And I think the final question for today, and it brings us back, I think, to a full circle, since you have expressed your reservation towards the term hate speech, So this question coming from Talia, and she said, talking about emotions such as hate as part of how we refer to speech, would you say that it is in imbuing emotions into the discursive forms in which we refer to different aspects of control, like sexism, racism, is a form of naturalization that has been created by heterogenic symbolic systems?
Again, this is extremely complex, the relation between discourse and emotion. I commented on the question of hate speech to correct a misunderstanding, namely that people who write against men, against women, straight people against gays, and so on, at all levels, etc., they are not questions of emotions, but they are questions of power and power abuse. That's one thing. They write these kind of things not in excited, kind of, etc. So that's one very important thing. So in order to understand things like hate speech, we also should know about emotion. That's one thing. But I'm not saying the emotion is not very important in communication. Of course they do. So when people read this particular text, which is not written with lots of hate, but which says something about these terrible refugees or immigrants who take away their jobs and so on and so on. And they are in a situation in which you have just lost your job, or you have miserable income, or you are being discriminated yourself or whatever. Now, that particular kind of text, which is produced and reproduced by some kind of symbolic elites or by their followers in social media, that particular kind of text, of course, can have an emotional reading and interpretation that people do so in everyday life in a specific situation of a context. Emotions are contextual. They're personal, they're contextual. People get mad because in that situation, and if many people are in a similar situation, yes, emotions can go in one way, and that way you call hate or whatever. But don't forget, again, it's a theoretical question we cannot debate today, but it's part of theoretical debates I have. One can share beliefs, one can share knowledge, one can share attitudes, one can share ideologies. Therefore, you have ideological groups and so on and so on. But strictly speaking, you cannot share emotions, because an emotion is always you yourself. It has to do with your body. Emotions are embodied. Many people can be in a demonstration, can be furious, but each person still has her or his own emotions. They may share an evaluation, they share an opinion, share an ideology, and so on. They can share many things, critical and so on, but the emotion is always personal. Now, that is not something everyone agrees with, but it's a theory. But I think it's very important to distinguish between beliefs, prejudices, ideologies you share, like knowledge, group, more large groups, one thing, and emotions. So emotions just have a role in the individual way people are reading and understanding and processing this particular kind of discourses of the symbolic elites. That, yes, is relevant in their everyday life. And if you are in a social situation in which you are prone to have this particular kind of emotion, this particular kind of messages can have that particular kind of influence. Typically when you lose your job and so on. Now that is true and is very important.
Thank you very much. Oh, Professor Van Dijk, you have inspired us so much today, and I feel very privileged really to be able to talk to you. So on behalf, I said, of the organizers of the symposium, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And you've given us ideas, for our future research work, for ways to show solidarity, and you also propel us audience to constantly examine and question, the bombarding news and information thrust to us, with a more critical and inquiring mind, which is needed for the current political situation, especially in many countries in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much once again, and a virtual round of applause to you from us.
Thank you again. Thank you, Verita, for your presentation, for your excellent way of communicating also the questions. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you and to many people. I am hoping to be able to come back to Southeast Asia next year. Actually, we have, as you know, I've been involved in forming an association in Latin America of discourse studies. One of my many plans is to also try to stimulate the formation of an association of discourse studies in Southeast Asia. And I definitely hope to come back to Thailand and other countries there, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, and to stimulate my colleagues there to get together in their own countries, communicate with people in other countries in Southeast Asia. And there's lots of interest in Southeast Asia and discourse studies and also critical discourses, but you have to do it, and I'm sure you can do it. And if a year from now, there's lots of interest in doing so, I hope to be able to be there to talk to people who take that initiative. So I'm very happy to be able to speak to people in Southeast Asia today and others who are listening today. And I'm learning from them, and I'm hoping to be able to be back. Thank you again for the invitation. And it was a privilege, a pleasure, and an honor to speak with you. And read all things critically, also mine. Please never accept any kind of symbolic elites. I am also a symbolic elite. So read me always critically. Thank you for being there.
Fantastic. And I believe I can say on behalf of the audience as well, you're most welcome in Southeast Asia. We were very happy to have you. Please let us know anytime. So last note, though, I would like to send a gentle reminder to the audience to check out what's on the symposium program on the website holocausteducation-asia.org. And I hope to see you tomorrow for the next event. And so once again, thank you very much for all the questions, the good questions. Thank you for your participation. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.